Hi, my name is Joy Axelson. I've been working with the online SBS since 2010, and today we're going to be talking about the book of Hebrews. I want to start out with thinking about, in the Western world, many people think it's okay to believe whatever you want to believe. That there is no real truth. But we as Christians, we say that we have the real truth. And why is that? What makes Christianity different than any other religion? Well, many of the other religions are based on works, whereas Christianity is based on a person, on Jesus. And so in the book of Hebrews, we can see how the author defines Jesus, that he is one as the Son of God who came on earth to suffer and to die, and that he rose again, and that he sat victorious at his Father's right hand, so that people through faith can have forgiveness of sin and have access to God. It's that simple. But the reality is, Christianity is based on Jesus and belief in him as a person, as the Son of God. But it looks like the author is very clear and gives a very clear gospel message, because this is what the original reader were struggling with. And so that's why he emphasizes that in this book. So let's take a moment and take a look at what is happening in the book of Hebrews. So we want to look at some repeated ideas and words. For example, the repeated word superior, better, and excellent, those three, which they're basically the same idea, they're repeated 12 times. For example, we can see in chapter 1, verse 4, where it talks about that Jesus is superior to angels. It talks about in 7:7, there's a superior covenant. In chapter 7:18, there's a better hope. In 7:20, there's a better covenant. In 9, verse 23, there's better sacrifices. In chapter 11, verse 16, there's a better country. In 11:35, there's a better life. And so on. This just going to give you an example. Another repeated word is heavenly. For example, in chapter 3, verse 1, there's a heavenly calling. In chapter 6, verse 4, there's a heavenly gift. In chapter 12, verse 22, there's a heavenly Jerusalem. So there's this repeated idea of something better, of something heavenly. And also this book contains a comparison between Jesus and all the aspects of Judaism. For example, the prophets, the angels, the old covenant, the old law, the old sacrificial system, the Levites, the priests. All of these things are compared to Jesus, and Jesus is shown as what? He's shown as superior. So the main message of this book is to show that Jesus is superior to everything, that he's superior to Judaism. Now we want to look at some BRI information. So who is the author? Does this book say directly who the author is? Well, no, there isn't a title. The author doesn't say, I am whoever writing to whoever. But we can find out some things about who the author is from internally looking into the book. If you look at Hebrews chapter 2, verse 2 through 3, we can see that he's a second generation believer, that he heard the gospel from the apostles. So he's not first generation, so he's not one of the apostles, but he's a second generation believer. In Hebrews 6:10 and chapter 10, verse 32, chapter 12, verse 4, and chapter 13, verse 2, we can see that he is familiar with the original reader's situation from their past and to their present. We can see in chapter Hebrews 13:19 that he's been with them before and that he hopes to visit them again. And then from Hebrews 13, verse 23, we know that he knows Timothy. Some more information that we can see about the author is that he knew the Greek Septuagint very well, because this is the Old Testament quotes in this book. There's 41 of them that they're all quoted from the Greek Septuagint. The author was eloquent in his Greek style and writing and his vocabulary. He uses 169 Greek words that are only used in the book of Hebrews. He was very logical and had thought out arguments. He used Greek imagery, like the runners, like the anchor in chapter 2. And we see that he had a real pastor's heart and that he was very concerned about the original reader, but yet he also spoke with authority. So some external evidence for who the author is. Well, in history, it has been thought that Paul was the author, but in more recent, most historians or scholars would say that he's not. There's always been church fathers who thought he was and church fathers who thought he wasn't. Some example of church fathers who supported Paul as the author was Clement, Augustine, and Jerome. Some church fathers who thought that Paul was not the author was Irenaeus, Calvin, and Luther. So why was Paul probably most likely not the author? Well, the style and language of the writing is different than his letters. Also, Paul always put his name on his letters, and also he always said that he got his revelation directly from Jesus. So he would not count himself as a second generation believer, but he was a first generation. So there are many possible authors who are suggested as you read through different Bible dictionaries or commentaries, but I'm going to show with you 3 of the most popular. Barnabas. He was from Cyprus, and he was which was known for excellent Greek, and he was also a Levite. We see that in Acts chapter 4, verse 32. So he would have known about the Levitical priesthood and everything to do with the sacrifices. He was also known as the son of encouragement. We see that from Acts 4:36. And Hebrews author refers to this letter as a word of encouragement or exhortation. We see that from Hebrews 13:22. So perhaps it's a play on words of his name. Problems with Barnabas is we don't see anything more about him after his breakup from Paul. We don't have any record of him outside of Antioch or not working with Timothy, so we don't know. Another possibility was Apollos. Apollos was from Alexandria. We see that from Acts 18:24. And in Alexandria is where the Septuagint was made, and it was known for a Greek hotspot of culture and literature. And he was also very eloquent and very well versed in the Old Testament. And he was very fervent in his preaching about Jesus. And we see that in the references in Acts and 1 Corinthians. He powerfully disputed with the Jews about Jesus in Acts 18:28. He was also associated with Priscilla and Aquila in Acts 18:26. So most likely he was somewhat associated with Paul and the people around Paul. He traveled around teaching in different places. We see that in Acts, 1 Corinthians, and in Titus 3:18. The problem is we have no record of him working with Timothy or no record of him being in Rome. Our third option, or most popular option I'm going to share with you, is Aquila and Priscilla. They had a house church in Rome and were most likely from Rome. You see that from Acts 18:26 and Romans 16:5. They were qualified to teach because we see them instructing Apollos and Acts. They were closely associated with Timothy. And in Hebrew, sometimes the author goes from we, using the pronouns we, to the pronouns I. And we see example of that in Hebrews 13, 18, and 19. And so you see that perhaps that could explain the use of a married couple. And also because women were really looked down on in that culture, that might be perhaps if they were the authors that they did not include their names on this book. Problem with them is that Well, it depends on where you think that the book was written from. If you think it was written to the church in Rome, the problem was the author seems to be writing to the audience who were under persecution, and he doesn't say we, but he says you. So if it would have been Aquila and Priscilla, they would have been with the church in Rome. So that's something to think about. But the conclusion about authorship. The church father, Origen, what he said about the Hebrew authorship, he said, only God knows. So basically, it's just your own guess. So who are the original readers? Well, we can see some things about them from the text itself. So some internal evidence. They were believers for a while. They're not new converts. We see that in chapter 5:12 and 10:32. They're second generation believers, but they have seen the evidence of the gospel through signs and wonders in chapter 2, verse 3. They're being a little bit lazy in chapter 5:11 and 6:12. They're losing their heart. They're losing confidence in the gospel in chapters 12, verse 3 and 12. They're growing weary under persecution. We see that in chapter 2:18, chapter 10:32, and chapter 13:3. They've already experienced a past persecution at some point in the past. That's in chapter 10, verse 32 through 36, but yet not to the point of shedding of blood. So probably not martyrdom yet. And we see that in 12, verse 4. Maybe they're afraid of death. Chapter 2, verse 14 through 15. They had been generous. We see that in chapter 6:10. Also, it looks like they're losing their initial enthusiasm and confidence in their faith. We see that in chapter 3, verse 6 through 4. Chapter 4, verse 14. Chapter 10, 23 through 35. And they need a strong word of exhortation, of encouragement. Chapter 3, verse 7. It seems like they're not growing or really progressing in their faith, so they're lacking in spiritual maturity. In chapter 5, verse 12 through 14. And they're easily going astray in chapter 13:9. Another problem they're having is that they're failing to meet together for fellowship or in their house churches, and we see that in chapters 10, verse 25. They're not being loyal to their leaders as they need to be. We see that in chapter 13:17. They're in real danger of falling into unbelief in chapter 3, verse 12, and maybe the danger of leaving their faith, of apostasy. We see that in chapter 3:12 and chapter 10:23. So because of all the details and the comparison of Jesus to the Jewish religious system, most likely the audience would primarily be Jews. Also, we see in another hint about the audience is perhaps from chapter 13, verse 24, where it talks about when the author is ending it. Let's see, he says, and you know that our brother Timothy has been released, with whom I shall see you if he comes. Verse 24, greet all your leaders and all the saints. Those who come from Italy send you greetings. So the phrase here, those from Italy send you greetings, this can be translated in two ways. It can be translated that the letter was written from Italy, or it could be that the author is somewhere else and he has some Italians who are with him and they're sending greetings back to their friends there in Rome. Most likely, as the verse we just read, that the original reader, they personally knew Timothy. And all the Old Testament quotes in this book are, as we said before, the Greek Septuagint, so they would have been Greek speakers. So what can we conclude so far about the original reader? Well, they had been mostly a Jewish audience, Greek speakers, and they're considering turning back to Judaism, of leaving Christianity back for Judaism. Okay, so which Old Testament book is Hebrews most like? Well, it reminds us a lot of the book of Leviticus, because the Leviticus really describes the Old Testament sacrificial system. And the writer of Hebrew constantly compares the inadequacy of the Old Testament system to the perfect and completion of salvation through Jesus. And he talks about how the old Levites and the priest had to sacrifice continuously over and over, where Jesus, as the perfect high priest and the perfect sacrifice, only had to sacrifice himself once and everything was completed. So through Jesus, people can have direct access to the throne of God. So where are the original readers located? Well, there's different possibilities, but two possibilities are that they're a group of Jewish priests in Israel. But the most problem with that is that the Jewish Levite priests in Israel, they would not most likely use the Greek Septuagint. They would have used the Hebrew Old Testament. So the other possibility, most likely, would be Jews, believers in Rome. So this is the most popular viewpoint of who the original reader are. So the church in Rome was established sometime around 30 AD. We see that from Acts 2. So it was a mature church. They were Hellenistic Greek speakers. The Jewish believers in Rome had experienced a first persecution in 49 AD when Claudius kicked out all of the Jews from Rome. And so this might be talking about the first persecution that the original readers experienced in Hebrews 10, verse 32 through 34, where the author says, in the former days they suffered affliction. Some of them were in prison. Some of them were, their property was taken away. The Jews were let back into Rome by Nero in 54 AD, so they were gone for several years. But then the Nero persecution started in 64 AD. So this might refer to the second persecution that the original reader are presently experiencing. So think about back to the book of Mark when you think about and remember what was it like for the Christians during the Nero persecution, of them being blamed for the fire in Rome and them going to have to hide in the catacombs, and them starting, well, a lot of them were persecuted and eventually they were murdered and martyrs. So that's something to think about. So when was this book written? Well, it was written during Timothy's lifetime. We see it from Hebrews 13:23. Tradition says that he died in 81 AD. Clement of Rome mentions Hebrews in one of his letters from Rome to Corinth in 96 AD, so it had to be written before that. There's no mention of the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It seems like when the author is writing this book that the sacrifice system is still going on, and it seemed like if the fall of Jerusalem would have happened and the destruction of the temple, that he would have mentioned that in this letter. So most likely it was written before 70 AD. And also another occurrence that happened that kind of started the downfall of Jerusalem was in 66 AD, where the high priest, the people were starting revolting against the Romans, and the high priest and his brother were trying to stop them from this revolt, and they were killed. So it seems like if that would have happened before the book was written, the author would have mentioned that. So that most likely the book was written before 66. So since the Nero persecution started in 64, the most likely dates range is between 64 and 66 AD. So what type of literature is the book of Hebrews? Well, it's not really your traditional standard letter, first century letter. It doesn't have the author or the readers. It doesn't have a prayer. It doesn't have a thanksgiving or no greeting in the beginning. But it does end in a traditional way where it gives personal information, a greeting, a dioxylium, and a farewell. But it is very similar to a sermon or an exhortation. So if we read in chapter 13, verse 22, the author says, "I appeal to you, brothers, bear with my word of exhortation, for I have written to you briefly." So it's sort of like a sermon, because this letter contains encouragement, exhortations, and warnings like any sermon can contain. And sometimes the author in this book, he talks about speaking. For example, if we look in Hebrews 2, verse 5, he says, "Now it was not to angels that God subject the world to come, of which we are speaking." If he was just writing a letter, would he mention that? I don't know. Another incident, he says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, he says, "And what more have I to say?" So this letter is more like a sermon. But it's possible that the author had this as a sermon or wrote a sermon and put it in written form. The structure of the book, there are 5 main exhortation sections. And that's chapter 3, 1 through 6, chapter 4, 14 through 16, chapter 10, 19 through 23, chapter 2, 1 through 14, and chapter 13, 1 through 25. And there's also 5 main warning sections, which we see in chapter 2, verse 1 through 4, chapter 3, 7 through 13, chapter 5, 11 through chapter 6, verse 20, chapter 10, 26 through 39, and chapter 12, verse 15 through 20. Chapter 10, verse 26 through 39, and chapter 12, 15 through 29. Okay, what are some of the main themes of this book? Well, we see that Jesus is superior. We've already talked about that, and you clearly see that through the book. Another theme is the call to endurance. The original reader are to resist the temptation to return to Judaism. The author calls them not to fall into apostasy, but to hold fast to their confidence and confession of their faith. So we see repeatedly the idea of holding fast to their confidence, and that they suffered just as Jesus had suffered. Another theme is that Jesus is the ultimate high priest, that his sacrifice was perfect and complete. Another theme is the idea of the perfection and having access to God. So it's not talking about moral perfection that we'll never sin on this earth, but the idea of perfection in this book is the idea of Jesus's perfected work of salvation. He's completed the work of salvation. And that it gives, because of this completed work, it gives the believer free access into the presence of God. It also contains the idea that salvation is now and not yet. That the completion of salvation comes at the second coming when we all enter into the presence of God. The idea of perfection in this book could mean to finish, to complete, to reach a goal, to be qualified. So it refers to the complete work of salvation through Jesus. Another theme is you hear continuously in this book, the voice of God. That the original reader are listening to the voice of God speaking directly to them. Okay, for example, let's look at Hebrews chapter 10, verse 5, where it says, "And the Holy Spirit also bear witness to us, for after saying, and then the author quotes an Old Testament quote. So several times in this book, the author will use an Old Testament quote and saying to the original reader that God is speaking directly to them in their situation through the Old Testament and through the letter that the author's writing to them. Another theme in this book is the idea of a shadow versus the heavenly realm. That things from the Old Testament system are a shadow or type of the new. For example, Melchizedek was a type or shadow of the priesthood that Jesus is. For example, the Levitical sacrifice system was a type or shadow of Jesus as high priest, as perfect sacrifice. The type of rest that God wanted to give to Israel when they entered into the promised land is a type or shadow of salvation that comes through the work of Jesus. So let's take a moment and think about, put our shoes in the place of the original reader. And what would their Jewish mindset or expectations be? You know, Abraham was so important to them. He was the father of their nation. They were proud of the fact, Jews were proud that they were God's chosen people. You know, they had gone through the Exodus. They'd seen God's great miracles. Moses was their great leader, and through Moses, God gave them the amazing Old Testament covenant and gave them the law. God gave them the Levitical sacrifice system with the tabernacle so that a holy God could live among his people. And this was the way that they worshiped God, that they were unique in the sense that God himself dwelled among them. They were given the promised land. But because of their sins, after hundreds of years, they eventually went into exile into Babylon. But they did come back. And they built another temple after they had the great temple with Solomon. But their second temple wasn't as great as his, of course. But yet they had all the prophets and they had the prophecies of the coming Messiah. And so over those hundreds of years, there was this expectation of the Messiah, which eventually developed into the idea that the Messiah would come as a great and glorious physical king. And so those during the Roman Empire, they expected that the Messiah would come and deliver Israel from the reign and the control of the Roman Empire, that he would set them free, that they could be their own nation. So the problem that with the Jews at this point is basically their religion became a religion of works and not of faith. And that's what God wanted them to understand from Abraham all the way to where they were now, that it was all about faith. And so remember how the Jewish believers in 49 AD, their first persecution they experienced was because they were Jews. And they were kicked out of Rome, but they were let back in. But now, under Nero's persecution in 64 AD, that this persecution is only against Christians. In the Roman Empire, the Judaism was seen as a legal, accepted religion, where Christianity wasn't. They just thought Christians were kind of weird. And so Christians, only Christians were being persecuted during Nero's persecution, just because they were being blamed for the fire in Rome. So most likely some of these original readers, they're now starting the experience of this new persecution, and they're thinking, should we go back to Judaism? Because if we're go back to this, we won't experience persecution. It's a safe religion. But the main reason that the author is writing this letter is he's warning the original reader, do not fall away from the truth of what you have, which is much better than the old. Don't leave Christianity to go back to Judaism. Jesus is so much superior. Why would you want to go back? Don't even consider it. So going back to the beginning of this lecture of how we describe Christianity, that Jesus is the Son of God that came to earth as a man, God as man, to suffer, to die, but he was rose again and victorious at the Father's right hand, so that people through faith might have direct access to God and forgiveness of sin. So this is what the original reader are to hold on to, and this is what we are to hold on to as well. Thank you.